All right, well, good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. Today, we're going to be talking about documentation best practices for projects. And one of the things that's kind of interesting in many of the seminars that we do with people is that at some point in that seminar, something will come up about the lack of documentation or how bad the documentation is that is provided or something like that. And so this has been something that's been I've been toying with for some time. And so I decided I was going to write a short module to be able to do within a very short time about documentation. So I'm going to hit a broad perspective on documentation and try to give you some ideas that will help you with the documentation and maybe spearhead some things. One of the areas that seems to be one of the weakest happens to be with documentation from vendors. And many of you verbalize this in class and what the vendors do or do not do. But in addition to that, you also find that documentation from people internally on some of the projects is horrible as well. So let's just kind of lay some groundwork here, and then we'll kind of dive deep into this in this next hour. So let's define documentation. Documentation is going to be any type of material, documents, references, or body of knowledge used as a project reference. It transfers the know-how to those in need and assists in understanding when a project is over. It assists in giving options by understanding the building blocks of the original project. Now, I went with this definition on purpose because of all the different components that people bring up in class of not being able to maintain a project after it is finished from a vendor, and not being able to know why people chose a particular route or a particular solution. And so those different aspects is one of the reasons why we went in this direction for this for the definition. Documentation also details the various aspects of the project from beginning to end, with certain things such as specific documents throughout the project, detailed outcomes, analysis, writing of the business case and the charter based on facts, not fantasy that sometimes people will create, keeping records for archiving, building processes and strategies for maintaining the project after completion. Now, I'm going to give you a list of documents that you probably already have in the sequence here in just a moment that's part of your documentation, but then we're going to talk about some customized and specific documentation for you. Project documentation sets the bar for the project outcomes and goals and gives an intimate view of success. Project documentation is a form of plans that helps direct the strategy and approaches for project performance. But project documentation is going to be more than the project plan. The project plan might be very workable, but your documentation for handoff is sometimes some of the worst things that we get involved in. Project documentation helps to focus on project managers, which status indicators are important, because once again, you're going to be measuring those particular indicators. And project documentation is tricks of the trade written in simplified language. It's easy to follow, such as excellent documentation is never written to show how smart a group is about a topic. Excellent documentation should write with enough detail to help anyone follow the steps, and excellent documentation should be followed as a test before publishing them for others. Now, this material here actually came from many people, and might even be some of you on this call, because when we've talked about documentation, this is really when the smoke clears, what we really want from that documentation. We want something that's easy to understand, fast to read, and it's going to take us through the proper steps. There's not some step in the middle that they left out that's going to cause everything to fall apart. And this has come up also from working with vendors who should be providing documentation at the end, but also it's from providing a documentation internally of what happened. Many of you have higher turnover than some, and so what happens is you'll have certain people work on a project, but there's no documentation. You're having to assume you know what they did or did not do. Now, one of the components of documentation is going to be this documentation management. How are we going to manage documentation from the beginning to the end of the project? And by the end of the project, I'm talking about handoff and that documentation that we're going to be handing to the customer. So it focuses on the generation of project documents for analysis and knowledge sharing. It can include required mandated documents for every project or customized to be special to one project. Some projects use document managers as tools for influencing the project forms, templates, and plans. Now, Hill wrote about this in his book on the PMO because the PMO normally maintains the methodology, but they normally create the templates too, as you know. And so documentation management is going to have to be something sometimes that we think about. The longer the project, the more important sometimes this is. Doesn't mean it's not important for some of the smaller or shorter projects, but normally if you're running a lot of different projects, you're looking at documentation for everybody. And here's the key: you're wanting a balance here of where there's enough documentation for people to be able to run the project or to be able to fix whatever is needed on that project. But at the same time, we don't want to inundate somebody with so much documentation that it can't be practical for them to be able to use this. So the document managers are tools one uses to automatically format all documentation. Using tools like this increases costs sometimes because you're trying to buy that tool for everyone. And this is one of the gaps I think that happens between an organization who has an RFP go out and then the vendor who does this, is that we might have very brief statements about documentation, but we don't really have documentation detailed, and we might not have it detailed in the tool that they need to use or the type of format of those forms that they're going to be sending back. And so we're going to get into a little bit of this and just try to give you a few suggestions. You're probably already doing some of these, but just to give you some good ideas here. All right, so the usability of the documentation is really the desire of the customer. Some people can write documentation that nobody can understand, and yet they've qualified for the statement in the RFP to where they've done the documentation, they've handed it off, but if nobody can understand it, then that's a problem. So usability of that documentation. And so one creates it to hold people accountable as well as measure goals and standards. And some of the documents are formal goals, expectations, a selection process for projects. It could include forms and templates, plans, sub-plans, project proposal, lessons learned. And so some of these documents you have for sure, but many times the documentation that we have goes beyond just the standard forms or the standard plans that we have in all of our projects. How much documentation is needed? Now, if you're doing traditional projects, many times we want documentation to be, every breath is documented potentially. If you're doing Agile or Scrum, many times people will say, well, we don't have documentation because we're doing Scrum. And that's really not true. You do have documentation, but you're supposed to have just enough documentation. And so that means, in other words, how much documentation do we need, especially when we get ready to hand this off to the customer? So you're going to have some documentation. The preference, obviously, in Agile or Scrum is going to be face-to-face. But the end result is you're going to have some documentation that's going to be there. It needs to be there so that everybody understands what's going on. So documentation ranges from being extremely detailed, like in some of these monster waterfall projects, step by step, all the way to very generalized information where people don't need every blow by blow that took place in the project. The purpose of the documentation will make a difference on the depth and the content and the complexity of it. So if this is documentation just taking it through the project flow, that's going to take one viewpoint of the documentation. But if this is documentation that's going to go to the customer and they're planning on using that documentation to maintain the project and to be so that they don't have to hire another vendor to come in and fix something down the road, then your documentation has a totally different goal. It's going to have to be very precise, step by step, what to do as well as what not to do, because you're wanting to use it for maintenance purposes. So the documentation of a traditional or waterfall project will be more complex than an Agile or Scrum project. It just makes logical sense that it will be, because once again, your traditional project has more complexity to it, but it also doesn't deliver a product until the end, where Agile and Scrum are delivering products throughout the project. And so you're getting more vocal and more visual insight on that product or on that particular piece of the project, that iteration, every time you hand it off for the customer to begin using. Now, benefits of project documentation. First off, it's going to help leadership set project goals and objectives. Now, you're going to notice in a moment that one of the documents I'm going to start with, I'm going to go all the way back to the business case, because that is part of the documentation that many projects must have in order to run the project smooth all the way through the project. It keeps the project team focused and on always doing the most important things, and that's going to be through your project plan or through your iteration or sprint planning. It creates documents which build organizational support because people can see what you're doing, why you're doing it, and it helps build it all the way through. And it starts all the way even with your business case and goes into your charter, and then obviously into your project plan. It establishes a greater efficiency for the teams because the teams can understand the plan, even if it's an iteration or a sprint plan, they can understand it. And that documentation of understanding the overarching goals helps the team. And then they can forecast potential risk or unwanted circumstances. Because they understand the overarching general goal of that project, they can anticipate where there's going to be some potential problems down the road. Now, the adjustment levels of project documentation means that you should and could and should have adjustment in that documentation. You're not trying to create a book for every project. Some of these projects, you'd spend more time documenting some of that stuff than doing the project. So it'd be silly to try to have a super high level of documentation, but you still might need some documentation to be able to explain why you chose a different methodology, why you chose a particular solution, why you chose a particular vendor because of their expertise. And that might need to be part of that documentation. So a lot of times you might have small, medium, and large is how I positioned it here. So small, it might just be a project proposal, a business case, maybe even a closure report. That might be all the documentation that's really needed for that particular project. Medium could be a project plan, issue register, a risk plan, organizational change plan, in addition to the proposal, the business case, and the closure report. And then a large project obviously is going to have a lot of documentation in most cases if you're doing traditional project management, such as quality plan, procurement plan, continuous improvement plan, lessons learned, obviously handoff, a lot of those type of pieces, plus all the different documents from small and medium. So the point of this is just to really kind of show you that there can be different levels, and that's okay, because you're not trying to produce something that is an overpowerment of documentation when it's a small project or even a small work effort that's using project management. Now, I thought this was an interesting piece. This is some sample levels of quality documentation. And so they focused on just quality, but I liked what they did. And so they did a level 1, which was their quality manual, policies, and regulations. Then those were documented. A level 2 was a quality system procedures. 3 was procedures at the center, department, or unit level. 4 was work instructions, and 5 was forms, charts, and records. And so you'll notice as they start looking at these, they've got different levels for different pieces of the project and different levels for different types of projects. And so yours doesn't have to be anything like this, but it does make sense that the more complex the project, then obviously the stronger the documentation would need to be. So which projects should be part of the documentation? So here are some of the standard pieces. Should be which parts of the project should be part of the documentation, because this is some of the common stuff that we deal with here, such as business case. That would be part of your documentation because that sets the benefits of the project and also sets the return on investment. So it's very important for us to be able to understand from the business case perspective. The feasibility study is normally part of that business case or an input into the business case. And so we look to see, do we have the money? Do we have the time? Do we have the resources? And it might justify why we're vendoring something out because we don't feel like we've got the resources. And then a lot of times that feeds into your project charter. And your project charter, we know, is what authorizes the project and allows that project to be able to have a project manager and a budget that's going to go with that. If you're using traditional, you're going to have statement of work, a WBS, which is a work breakdown structure. You would have a project plan, which would be your plan, if a full plan, if you're running a project, traditional project. But if you're running an agile project, your project plan would be iteration plans that would go along, as well as your product backlog and so forth. You'd have performance reports. And these performance reports are going to be some type of sequence that you're going to have. That's part of your documentation, your lessons learned report. Now, there can be other types of documentation that are going to need to be there, especially when you're talking about maintenance and handoff to the customer. But the point is that these are going to be very common pieces of document. Now, many of you have seen project plans that were very loose. You've seen business cases that were not much more than a page, that didn't have a lot of analysis in it. You've seen feasibility studies in the same case. You've seen project charters that were potentially just a quarter of a page, had a name and who the project manager was, and just a very high level of what the project is. So all the documents that we have right here might not be working effectively even as they stand right now, and might need to be revamped. But at the same time, don't go to the furthest extreme to where you've got a 400-page charter, or those type of things. That might be overkill and doesn't give you any value. The other type of documentation that's beyond just those documents that we're looking at, that sometimes make a huge difference on the project you're working on, that many of you have verbalized, could be process documentation, what the process is now and why it changed, especially for those of you who are automating a process that has been manual for some length of time. Product documentation, which is documentation about what is produced from that project, the output of that, and then protocol documentation, which might make a difference on rules, regulations, and different type of guidelines. And so let's break it apart just a little bit on those. So let's say, for an example, you look at one of your projects, and so let's say it is changing process. Your whole project could be a process redesign for your organization or your agency or a division. Any of those things could happen. And so it details each process flow and what steps one needs to take. So if you've been involved in this, you know it's very important to do a visual as well as a narrative so that people understand what steps they should be taking to be able to complete something. So it's important really in the process documentation, though, to use this so that people understand here are the 5 steps and here's the why we're taking these 5 steps. Many times when you do this, you're cutting it out of 50 steps and you're breaking it down to here's the 5 that we need to take. So it's important for solving problems. It focuses on how to perform the process, not on necessarily on the creation of the process. You and your team have already brainstormed, you've already used sticky notes, you've already walked through the process mentally, you've already gone out and even maybe walked through it physically to make sure this is the right process. That's not what it's all about. It's going to just show the process, and it's going to go through the steps of those process and why. So execution of the process is the main reason for process documentation. It explains how to follow the process and the expectation for each of those sections. And many of us have done this. Many of us have done that where you've changed the process. Maybe we did not create a Visio chart of the process with steps and explaining what's happened. Usually that's the area that's kind of weak, but that would need to happen in order for people to understand what we're doing and why. So when we look at process documentation, it's a roadmap to fix problems of a specific manner. It must focus on continuous improvement and lean concepts for improving the engagement of the organization with the customer. And it's violated when the process changes and no one updates the documentation or the new steps. And that's one of the things that's so sad, is that sometimes you'll start looking at documentation, and as you look at the steps that are being taken or have been taken by people in the past, we're not even following our old documentation. We're following something that's been outdated for years, and yet you hand somebody a manual and they think that's what we're following, but that's not the case. So that's process documentation. And so there could be obviously much more to that. Many of you have much more experience than what we've ever talked about or what I have. But so it's very important to document that process. Second thing that we would look at that might be specialized documentation could be on the product itself, the output that you have. So you give the details of the product, how it should function. And so as you detail this is where you bring the expectations of the stakeholders back together on what this product is going to do and what this product is not going to do. And sometimes, stakeholders will get that grandiose idea. So it must focus on accurate information, which any worker can understand when trying to solve a problem. And so product features, specifics on each feature is explained for transference of knowledge so that people understand what that feature is, what that feature does, what it doesn't do. And that way, whoever you're handing this project off to understands, here's how the feature works. Changes when the product features change or when the organization chooses new products. Obviously, you don't need this type of documentation. It needs to be updated. But if we get new features we're going to be using, then obviously the documentation would have to be updated so people understand how to use that. A third type of specialized documentation that fits this would be what we would call protocol. Protocol documentation. Now, Harold Kerzner, many of you are familiar with him. He's one of the big gurus across the world in project management. He has more masters and doctoral level people in project management using his textbook than anybody else. So he's a bona fide guru in this area, no doubt about it. And he's a phenomenal writer on so many of these things. But he points out that procedural documentation will accelerate the project management maturity model. And that's really what protocol documentation is. You're talking about the procedures that should be followed. Many of us would call these operational. Look in your operational book at your organization. And that's right, because sometimes those procedures change. Kerzner feels procedural documentation helps to create usable documentation. It creates standardization of the formats. It builds and documents the methods for running future projects, and it also helps analyze future projects. So that when you start looking at the procedures here, you're looking at trying to create some type of standardization. So you can see why a project management office would want to do this, or even a division would want to do this. All of our charters look very similar. All of our business cases use the same template and so forth. We even see this in a university setting where the doctoral candidates are given a template of what that dissertation should look like and what those sections should be. Nothing wrong with any of those things, because that helps get people jump started and they understand what each of those sections should be and what should be in that section. Kerzner also believes procedural documentation will help keep people reasonable and assist in managing the activities, the resources for the project. The procedures need to expand from the documentation to the culture of the organization. And I thought this was a great idea. I thought this was exactly what happens so many times, is that what happens is we change because of the culture, but we never update our documentation. And so if somebody's looking at an operations manual of how to do something, then what happens is we're doing something daily that's totally different than what our operational manual might be saying. But we might still need documentation that's not this formal even, and that's okay if we do this. Protocols and procedures are synonymous in some industries. Protocol documentation is any series of actions someone can take to achieve organizational goals, actions, and outcomes. Protocols can include any area of the organization and its guidelines. It can designate how to change the CEO or other executive leadership, as well as any operational duties. Protocols can tell how to accomplish something for the organization. And that's the reason why these areas change so slowly and less often. And so that's why many times you'll have a manual, an operations manual that includes this documentation. And so protocol documentation must include the rules or guidelines and justification of each. And protocols can change when one discovers it does not bring value to the organization and its outcome. Now, to make a point of interest here that benefits us as project managers, when we do a lessons learned and we are making recommendations back to management, we are doing a lessons learned and making recommendations back to management on how we can run our projects more efficiently and more effectively, but not just so that we could cocoon it over here in a project environment, but so that we can actually influence the organization to be more receptive to these projects running at a faster pace. So for an example, having 13 sign-offs on a project and you're getting bogged down after each sign off might make no sense. And the recommendation from a lessons learned might be, can we have 2 sign-offs and get rid of 11 of these sign-offs and be able then to be able to say, to move that project along faster. And so what you're looking at though, is you're looking at changes. That's what lessons learned does, is it makes changes. Now, here's some common documents per process that might be there. Now, maybe you do your documents a little different. Maybe your documents are different, call something different than this. That's okay. This is just to give you an idea. Okay, so the first feasibility study or feasibility report is normally found in initiation. Normally, your business case is found in the initiation process group, and so is your project charter. Of course, as you know, the project charter is normally looked at as the document that authorizes the project and appoints a project manager. And so that's the reason why some of these documents are there. Now, if your organization does it differently, then you might find your project charter over in planning, because the project charter is authorizing planning to start, but not the project manager. Maybe the project manager is appointed through some other document. So in planning, you normally will have the statement of work, the WBS, which is your work breakdown structure, and a requirements document. And those are all connected there in planning, because that's where planning starts. And so you're going to take those documents and you're then going to plan it, break it down into work packages and also into activities, because you're going to be loading this into your software, and so turn it into a schedule. Now, you remember that if you're looking here and you're looking for a budget, I followed traditional project management, where your budget is created at this point, because it's created in the WBS. If you recall, you break the WBS down, and that's where you get your time, and that's where you're going to get your budget, is through the WBS. If you start with a budget, as many of you do, then you have got the budget way up in the initiation or even before the initiation process. All right, the third is going to be execution. This is where we do all the work. This is where we spend all the money and get everything done. And so now we've planned that we're ready to execute. So this is going to include a traceability matrix. So it's able to trace what was listed over here in the WBS. We're going to show where it was actually completed. You'll have change orders, especially if you're running traditional project management. And then you're going to have a risk plan, which will normally be part of it, because you're going to have areas that's going to be more risky. Overall control is the performance side, monitoring control. It runs simultaneously with execution, because you're going to execute it and then you're going to be over in control within a week or so to see how it's doing. So that's your monitoring, that's your performance piece. So you're going to have your change plan, because you're having to change things to get things back on track, but you're going to have your performance plan, because you're going to be reporting those that information back, and so to management or to the project manager or the PMO, sponsor, whoever. And so that way they know what's happening with the project. And then closing is where you're closing the project out. But this is where you've got your verification plan. We're providing the scope of work that we said we would, all the way back up in the business case. But then also in closing, you're also handing off the transition and closeout plan. And this is how you're going to hand it off to the customer, so that they can now use the finished product of what you're doing. And then your lessons learned, of course, is going to be where you're looking to see what would we do different if we were doing this project again, and making recommendations to management on process or any kind of impediments or hurdles that were struggles as you were going through this. Now, let's talk a little bit about some guidelines for writing the documentation itself. Now, obviously, these are going to have to be fluid, because do we need brief documentation or do we need monstrous documentation? If you're running a power plant, your documentation is absolutely impeccable for everything. If you were writing documentation for how to fly a plane, those steps have to be impeccable, so that you can't miss anything. But you also, on a small project that you might be working on, the guidelines might be something totally different, much more informal. So all documentation needs to focus on the specific user. Who am I writing to? And even the language is going to make a difference. If I'm writing to professional engineers, my language is going to be far different than if I'm writing to frontline employees who all they have to have is a high school diploma. Now, it doesn't mean that one's not more valuable or not valuable or something like that. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that the knowledge that they bring to the table has to be considered. And so who are you writing to be able to make sure that you're specifying that documentation and adjusting that documentation in such a way that people can understand it. Also, keep the documentation's location publicized. People need to understand where this documentation is, where it can be found. If you're going to require templates, where can they find this? They don't need to look and be bogged down with all the red tape of trying to find all this stuff. They need to be able to know, okay, here's where the template's going to be. Make sure the documentation can give an example to make the steps clear, the action steps clear. And of course, a good template does that a lot of times. It'll show you a sample. Keep the documentation up to date and create headings and comprehensive indexes for easy use. Most of the time, people are using some documentation, but they might not be doing everything you want. Many of you have verbalized that about a vendor. They've done a lot of things, but they're not doing everything you want them to do. So what about a template? We'll talk about that in a moment too, but what about giving them a template? Here's what I want the documentation to look like, or here's the components components that we want it returned to us in. And so that way the vendor on their side understands what's going on. Create documentation focuses on detailing the right message to a specific audience. Audiences need clear warnings of dangers they could face in certain situations, as well as ways to use a process or a procedure. And so once again, you're talking to that person. If you've ever put together a bookshelf that came apart, the instructions are everything in being able to put some of those things together. And then what's so frustrating is sometimes it's not very logical in some cases, or not logical for you. And so we have a challenge with that. One of the things that I don't even remember what it was now, but it was something I think for one of the grandkids. And of course, all my instructions were Chinese, I had French, and I had Spanish, but I didn't have English for any of those instructions. And so, you're kind of doing it on a wing and a prayer then. But that's, that was just a happen thing. And I'm thinking, what's wrong with this? Not that I'm real good on the instructions anyway. I mean, many times I'll try to put it together without it as well. But the point I'm getting at is the documentation is there to take us all the way through those pieces. Okay, so when we talk about documentation, let's start off with the fundamentals of some of these clear definitions. What one person calls something, somebody else might call the same thing something different. You've all seen that in project management. Or we might encompass more in our term for that, for whatever that is we're talking about, than someone else. Some people will call it will be very narrow in their definition. Some will be very broad. We're experiencing that right now when we talk about agile or more Scrum. When we talk about Scrum and what you can and can't do in Scrum, many people are literalists on what Scrum was a few years ago, and I can only do this. And then some are much more broad because Scrum is encompassing a lot of other things right now. So here's a couple of things to consider when we're looking at documentation for definitions. Brainstorm a list of words which need defining and expanding or clarifying. That way we all are singing the same hymn. We know exactly what it means because we defined it within these perimeters. Even if the person doesn't agree, they still understand you. They still understand what you mean. Establish a clear definition of the term, specify when and how it's used. Give concrete examples to make the definition more understandable. Use words which connect with the target audience, and add graphics if needed with the terms to make all writing clearer. And so that's the reason why a lot of times when you see good instructions, it'll say it in the narrative, but then it'll show you a process of how to go through this, or it will show you what to do or what not to do in those cases. Now, documentation has to give instructions in some cases. So instructions show a safe way to follow a process for completing an action or following a task. Readers should gain knowledge for the next step of actions because, okay, we have to do this, then we have to follow it this way. Instructions have to give complete content and precise instructions to reduce audience mistakes, because even one little step that we assume somebody knows, they don't know. And that's the reason why so many times when we read some of these instructions, it's very dumbed down with every little step. And you think, okay, I know this, I know this. Okay, here's what I'm needing right here. And the point is, you know something, but they're starting from the beginning, as they should, with that documentation. It needs to give a list of requirements. So for an example, good documentation will give a list of requirements such as tools, detailing common tools used for a specific action. It helps the reader prepare ahead of time for the actions. Nothing seems to be worse than finding out you need a particular tool. You'll see this on many of your auto mechanic magazines or something. They'll talk about, here's the 3 tools you need to be able to do this. Even YouTube, some of your best YouTubes, I don't know if you're a YouTube junkie on fixing your house, but I mean, I don't want to pay anybody if I can keep from it. And so I'll watch 4 or 5 YouTubes to see if I can do something before I then turn around and hire somebody to do that. But some of the best YouTubes, as you know, are those who say, all I used was a fountain pen and a wire, and I was able to, install this. And so, we think, oh, I can do that. I've got a fountain pen, I've got a wire someplace. So we're ready to do that. Materials, any kind of equipment, supplies, data, or components to fulfill the action. Parts, any kind of part needing replacement must be purchased to speed up the completion. So we explain all of these pieces and what we're doing to be able to turn something around. Now we can do the exact same thing if it's not an actual physical thing. You can do that with what tools that somebody is going to need, what type of analysis they're going to need, what type of process they need to take to figure out why the software is not working correctly. So you can do this, but your tools might be different, your materials or your analysis might be a little different because of that. Now, documentation for the procedures themselves. Procedures establish actions required by the organization, agency, or oversight group. Procedures include best practices which consistently bring success when followed. Documentation of the protocols. Protocols are like procedures, and much of the language is similar. Protocols are precise steps, actions for specific situations. Protocols are not flexible, but must be followed exactly. And so all actors must follow the actions perfectly. So when you see these type of steps, and we see this more in operational manuals, then you realize I cannot change. I have to do it this way. Some of this might actually be something you put into the contract with the vendor. The vendor has to do something this way, or the documentation has to follow this same pattern. And so those are all some things that you could consider. Now, documentation rules for communication. Authors must be respectful and courteous in the writing, and as you're telling and explaining these things. You need to realize that not everyone will understand the material in the same way, because we all have different knowledge of it, and we bring certain things to the reading of this, but we also bring baggage to it that can actually distort some of this, because we could be a little negative on something as we walk into this. We have to show patience and grace to those who misunderstood the material or the steps, and being able to get them to turn it around. Be accurate in all directions, and no derogatory kind of comments. That doesn't mean you can't say, be careful with this, or warning for something, but derogatory comments would be something that would actually put someone down for making the mistake. Those type of statements do not and should not be there. So because of that, that's why we will go to templates, and we've created a series of templates, most of us have, for certain parts of our project. Nothing wrong with that, but you're really probably wanting to go to the standardization of that is what you'd consider. So templates are pre-designed to meet a certain need for the project or the organization. They give an outline or process to follow, which guarantees a particular output of specialized information. Templates are usable as a guide in documentation from the vendor or from the internal project team, and templates can save time and money, and most are customizable. And so you have the ability to be able to customize that and for that particular project or for that particular output. So why do project teams hate templates so bad then? Well, here's the thing. Project teams sometimes believe their project is special and will not fit a template. And that's exactly the tug that we all get into, is that my project doesn't have this component, and yet I've got to write something on that. So we've got to be able to have some leadway on some of the templates for some of those specialized projects that many of you are working on that might just really be a different kind of project. Customers think that if a template is used, the project team is not demonstrating creativity. We're trying to fit it into the box. And some of that could even be true. But the thing is that we need to be able to document it. Everything can't just be loosey-goosey out here and creative and have no documentation, because then even if you do create it, you're never going to be able to fix it because nobody knows what they did. So you've got to be able to have, even if you're needing that massive creativity component, to be able to document that process as you're getting there, so that people can back up and fix something if needed. Team members think they give all of the information and do not need a template to follow, because I'll remember what it said. I remember what we're supposed to do. And organizations many times have never used a template and don't see the need. Now, let me give you a warning here, okay? I'm not saying go out here and buy 101, easy templates to use with my agency, and we're going to use every one of these doggone things with a project. Oh my gosh, don't do that. You're going to strangle your projects like that. But that doesn't take away that you might need certain templates. And I think the real thing is to decide which templates will fit for your projects, which ones do you need that's going to benefit it, and that you seem to have gaps in those areas right now. So then you need to look at some standards for the documentation itself. So standards are set to maintain clear writing structure, appearance, expectations, and quality. And this is going to be a little more into the nuts and bolts of what should be said in the documentation. So there's two types of documentation standards. One is a documentation process of standards, and the other is documentation structural standards. So let's break it apart for you. So when we talk about process standards, documentation requires requires following a process in order to create and produce high-quality documents. Process standards require all parties to conduct research, edit material, or prepare the finished product for publication. And even though it's internal, it's still publication for people to read. And the process standards must include some flexibility to adjust for different types of documentation. So in other words, here's the process we're going to follow to be able to produce this documentation. So we research it a certain way. It goes through certain types of edits. It's going to be prepared. It's going to go through certain additional edits, and then it's ready for publication for people to be able to read that. And so that's called the process standards for documentation. Documentation, when you're looking at structural standards focus on producing documentation with a consistent look, feel, style, and quality. And so that's very important too, because once again, that's people who are going to feel comfortable with that type of reading. For an example, if you've ever read any of the of Ken Blanchard's books. And so the 1 Minute series books, they all have that same feel. They all have that same level of wording and verbiage in there. And of course, they've made sure of that. If you've ever read A Chicken Soup for Anybody's Soul that you have ever read, you know what I'm talking about. They all sound the same, and that's on purpose, because they're making sure that they all look, feel the same. And they've done that and made $1 gazillion off of it. So structural standards establish a level of quality which produces a high quality product for their customer base. And that way it feels right to them. They know they're reading their material because it's there. So here's a graphic that might help you a little bit when we talk about documentation, because documentation is going to take us through all these different levels here. And so let's start at the very top. Business case is with a feasibility study is usually one of the first documents. And if you don't use that, you probably have another document that you use in its place. And that's okay. Normally after that, you'll have a charter, which says it's going to be a project. And then normally right after that, you're going to go into the statement of work, because your statement of work is going to be the requirements and all of those different things. And so it's going to drill down into what was just in the charter. And then you're going to have the project plan, which is going to drill down from what was in the statement of work and the scope of the project. And then of course, you're going to have performance documents at the same time of the project plan, because remember the monitoring controlling piece. And then as the project closes out, you're going to have that lessons learned. What would we do differently in the handoff? And then the maintenance is going to be there, because that maintenance is going to be how that customer or even internal customers are going to be able to maintain this project and keep it going. So here's some additional tips. Establish who's the owner of the document. So are we the owners or are you the owner? Because that's going to make a difference on who's updating it and keeping it thorough all the way through. Documentation should include the plans and templates of the project. Make sure to document anything which could be a potential problem area. So you have to look at it with critical eyes. Now, don't be critical, but look at it with critical eyes of, I know what my expertise is and I know what your expertise is, but if they didn't have my and your level of expertise, what do they need to know to be able to make this decision? Keep the documentation simple. Clear, easy to read. Try to minimize the words. If you do have to use a word, like for an example, we will use the word grooming in Agile. Well, if somebody doesn't know Agile, grooming, they don't realize that all that is reprioritizing the features and functionality. So we use grooming, but then we explain it's reprioritizing the features and functionality. So if you're going to use a word, explain that word so that people know, oh, that's grooming. I see what that is. Adjust the documentation management system to something which makes sense for the size of the project and for what kind of operation you're trying to run here. So if this is something that has a lot of regulatory stuff, then you already are having to comply with some of these standards. If this is something that you're just trying to make sure we've got good documentation and run these projects with some consistency, then you've got a different level of documentation. So this was an interesting map that I saw in the documentation mapping. They took it through different levels of documentation or different tiers. And I thought this was really good, because this author, as he started with some policies, and then he went to processes and procedures, and then they went to instructions, and then they went to checklist forms and the records. Now, this was not specifically just geared for a project so much as it was just documentation in general. But I like the idea of this, because you probably already have some policies in place for your projects. And so you've got processes and procedures that are supporting those, whether they're documented or not, maybe not, but you probably have unspoken processes, okay? So you probably have some instructions of how a project should run, even if it might not be documented. So let's say we formalize some of that stuff, but the big piece that you're getting down to a lot of times is going to be down to that very last one, which is your checklist, your forms, and they said records, but I would say templates, because that's some of the things that you're wanting to speed things up. I'm not wanting someone to have to learn how to do a charter. Here's a template of how to do a charter, and let's get this going. Here's a template how to do a business case, and let's get this going. Here's a template of how to do a schedule and what it's going to look like, and let's get this going. So any kind of documentation we're needing for that would be beneficial in this. So it begins at the top of the pyramid, moves to the lower level. As one moves through to the lower levels, it becomes more granular and specific to an organization's work. Now, I'm talking about from a project, and they were talking about from an organization, but you can still see that principle as you're looking at it going down to that checklist level, because it's at checklist and form level that you're really wanting your people to work on with the project. And so the lowest level of the map focuses on checklists, forms, and records, which are a multitude of employees will see and use. Where what we would do is we would go down to the checklists and forms and templates, which your project team would use and which you would be communicating upward to management or to the customer. A documentation plan. This is a plan of how to do the documentation. Gives an overview and plan for all writing components for the project. So this is not a plan. This is not the project plan. This is a documentation plan. This is how we're going to satisfy these documentation requirements. So plans for technology projects focus on features, functionality, and level of quality, as well as other technical specs. And so how do we get those technical specs written to that level of compliance? Plans for non-technical projects focus on which documents to include in the project plan, level of documentation each of the project needs to meet with these requirements. And so because of the type of project you have will require the type of documentation. And so if you're doing a technology project, some of these technical specs are probably going to have to be very detailed for people to be able to work on those. Or if you're getting it from a vendor, you're wanting certain types of detail, but how has that detail been spelled out for that vendor? Documentation plans can specify the level of detail a specific plan must include, determine which plans are not needed for this project and why, give the purpose of each document, an understanding of who is the dominant user and reader, changes the whole dynamic of how it's flavored. And then documentation one uses with the maintenance of a project section after it is over might require an entirely different set of specifications for completion, because you're trying to give them the knowledge base to be able to fix something without bringing in a vendor. And that's one of the biggest things that we hear all the time, is that the vendors sometimes don't want to do the documentation because they want to be called back to fix something. And of course, you can understand that too. But at the same time, if documentation, you're not getting the documentation you want, you're going to have to change what that requirement is from those people. Documentation plans and graphics. Graphics, checklists, or process or flowcharts are powerful tools to use to clear up hard to understand steps. And that's the reason why you can put it narrative, but then to put a graphic in there, such as a flowchart, people are so visual. And so you're looking at the visual and you're reading the narrative to be able to tell me what I need to be doing step by step. Now, let me close for just a moment with that and answer some questions. And then I have two slides I want to tell you about that I'm excited about that we've started. If you're on our mailing list, you've already gotten it this week. But we've got two events that I want to talk to you about in just a moment. So let me stop and answer any question that you might have. So let me open this up to where I can see you if you want to ask a question. And we've got 30 something people on. So if you would like to ask, go ahead and ask me a question. Any questions that you might have on this about documentation?
Good morning.
Good morning.
So I have maybe not a question on the documentation itself, but when going through administrative changes and differences in the approach to documentation,
Mhm.
what is your recommendation for retaining the history? Because as we know, our use cases and business cases tend to be repetitive over time.
I think every organization, a lot of times your organization and their policy and procedures will actually have that for particular groups of how long they want to retain that. But I think it makes sense to retain it as long as you think that it would bring some kind of value. For an example, some of the older things that we're away from, like mainframe computers and stuff like that. Some documentation maybe is needed for some of that, but I wouldn't. We're not going back that far to look at how to do our projects right now, and especially technology projects. We're looking at other things. So I think that's going to be a moving target over time. That probably isn't bringing us any value, and so I would probably keep it several years. Of course, technology is moving so fast. Even keeping something 5 to 7 years might be too long because we're moving so fast. Every 18 months, technology is doubling, and we're seeing so many things explode. So I would say normally you'll have, okay, this is our mandate. We're keeping everything 7 years or 9 years or whatever it is. But those older things many times might not be of value to us.
Okay,
That's
thanks.
what I would say. Somebody else have a question?
I have one that's similar to that.
Okay.
You have all this documentation out there, but you have no idea where you put it.
I hear that, Steve. I hear that all the time too.
I always put things where I know where I won't forget them, and then I can't find them later. So how do you resolve that?
Oh my gosh, we would be billionaires if we could figure that one out. I mean, I hear that all the time, and you are so right. There has to be, and the big thing that we're missing on the documentation, you're absolutely correct, is the ability to search for it. And so many companies or many organizations, they document it with a code, or it has a project name. But the problem is that over time, everybody forgets what that name is. And so a lot of times the documentation, and we'll see if this fits you guys too, a lot of times the documentation is only as good as I've got somebody that knows about that old project to be able to benefit us, to say, hey, we did this 3 years ago, and here's the name of it, and we can find it. But yeah, you are absolutely right. And I don't have anything other than, hopefully we're going to come to a point to where we can search more things than just the name or the number. Some of our searches with other things allows us to be able to put some type of additional wording in there that's not the name, and it's not a code that our company's following, to be able to cause us to do this. On our computers, we can do this with a lot of our documents that we have. And so hopefully we can get to a point to be able to do that. But that's exactly what the downfall of this documentation is that we can't search it to find that particular thing like we can on our computer for something. So we've got to be able, I guess technology just hasn't gotten there yet for that level of documentation within a company. Even though I'm doing it with I'm practicing with just even my laptop, with my doctoral students, certain things that I've written for certain questions. I've been tracking that, but I can do it on my laptop, but I can't do it. I can't do it for the documentation of a company either. So that's the $1 billion question. And whoever comes up with that will be a billionaire, because you hear it all the time. You're absolutely correct. Any other questions before I get you out of here right on time? All right, let me show you these last 2 slides, something that we're super excited about that we're going to be doing. First off, many of you maybe got something from Kim on our mastermind group. We started looking at some different ways that we'd be able to help some people. Many people who enter into a PMP bootcamp come in without filling anything out for an application, and sometimes the information on the PMI site sometimes is just overwhelming anyway. So one of the things that we're going to do, we're running 2 of these this year, is that we've decided we're going to do a 5-day, but it's only 5 hours is really all it is, but it's going to last 5 days. You're going to have an hour a day mastermind group. And so it's free of charge. People will sign up for it. And so it's not a boot camp, but it's going to help you do some of that preliminary stuff of getting the application ready, understanding what you're looking for and not looking for in trying to find a boot camp, looking at what is realistic on how long it's going to take me to study and not study. And so we're going to do several things with this, and we're going to provide you with some material that's going to help you do some pre-study for this, plus help you start filling out your application and your documentation, because usually that's really clumsy to us. So here's some of the benefits that we're going to bring to the table. And so we've got our first one in August coming up here that you'll see, but you'll have some videos. I'm going to cut some videos, the very specific videos that week that you'll be able to watch. You're going to get a copy of our PMP exam memory chart. This is going to be current with the new changes that took place January of 2021. And so you're going to have a PMP exam memory chart, which is going to be some of the topic areas that's going to help you be able to memorize some of this stuff and just get familiar with it. You're going to take a 25 question practice test, PMP test. We purchased questions from PMI. And so we're making that investment into you to give you a chance to get a feel of what some of those questions will be. Even though they have thousands of questions, we want you to feel what it's like. And we teach you in the boot camp how to handle that. Directions on filling out the application, audit possibilities. We'll talk about some of that. And then we'll walk you through the PMP exam content objectives. And so these are the new content objectives that are not like anything that has ever been before that just took place January 2nd, 2021. So it's going to be 5 hours. It'll be 1 hour a day, 5 days. You can jump on and jump off all you want. 2 of those nights, and so it'll depend on the group, but 2 of those nights I'm going to do a Zoom call with the group. And so it'll be in the evening. And so we'll have 2 of those, like a Tuesday, Thursday or something, to where people can get on and I can talk with them and they can ask some questions. And then anybody who's in this group is going to be registered for a free PMP. And so what that means is that we will have a drawing from each of these. So we're going to be giving one away per group. And so we've got one in August and another one in October. And so we will give one person they'll get free attendance to attend one of our live virtual events with me. And so they'll go all the way through it. And then they'll pay for their own test, but they will not have to pay for the PMP exam prep boot camp. They'll get that for free. So we're giving one of those away for each of those as a scholarship for somebody attending that. So we're excited about that. And so maybe you've got your PMP and you don't need that, but you know of someone else that could benefit them. And even if they don't come to our boot camps down the road, that's fine. But we still see this as a gap that people need some help with. And then next month, our webinar is going to be on project health checkups. This is going to be, we're going to talk a little bit about auditing the project as a project manager or even as a PMO. And we're going to talk about health checkups of how to look and make sure our project is going in the right direction so it doesn't go haywire and go off path down the road. So we're going to be pulling in and talking a little bit about project recovery there, but mainly how to know things are going haywire before it does. So this will be some new content for you maybe next month. So any last minute questions before I get you out of here? Let me open this back up. Any last minute questions before we go? All right, well, listen, I wish you well this week. Starting Monday, we go to Grams Camp. So we're out of pocket for a week. And at Grams Camp, we will have 10 grandchildren here for the week and no parents allowed. So it's going to be a great week with all these grandkids. And so Wanda and I close the office up. And so we'll monitor emails a little bit if you guys need something. So listen, I hope you have a wonderful weekend. Thank you so much for being on here. And you guys have a great week. Okay, bye guys. See y'all next month.
Thanks, Keith.
Thank you, Keith.
You're welcome.